evening out there in the electronic ether. This is ReverendZ, and I've been avoiding doing this video because I don't want to do this. I just don't want to do this video, but it has to be done because this particular situation does give us something interesting to talk about forgiveness, about when to or what to do if someone is continuing to be, let's say, evil, bad, whatever. But how do you recognize when someone has repented and when they should be allowed back into the, let's say, the public discourse because of that? Now, in Virginia, we have the governor and the third in line, or the second in... We have two of the three high officials in Virginia politics in the executive branch who have admitted to blackface. Now, the governor, there was a picture. He said that it wasn't him, and he wasn't the guy dressed up like a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Who cares? But his defense was he wasn't in blackface that time, but he had dressed up in blackface another time. So we're just going to assume these two guys had worn blackface, and it was many years ago, simply because we're just. I'm not going to debate whether or not he's lying about when he was wearing blackface, because it's too silly at this point. We're also going to skip the lieutenant governor because that's an entirely different kettle of fish, and we're not touching that at this point because it just. In the previous video on blackface, we touched on a news personality defending blackface, and a high school where they allowed blackface very recently. And I went over what I felt were the sins with blackface. And just to recap, if you didn't see that previous video, I am a person that has spent a fair part of his time as a circus performer, and people that were originally wearing blackface were trying to steal money from black performers. And that's how blackface started. Blackface, people talk about blackface being, well, that's part of our heritage, that's something of this or that. No. Some poor white people saw some black people making a little bit of money in minstrel shows and said, hey, I need to steal that off of them. That is the heritage of blackface. That is blackface at its basic foundation. So if you're defending it as part of your heritage or this or that, you don't understand the history of it. Now, obviously, it has continued to evolve when it was being used by white folks. When the black minstrel shows were doing things, they would have people in whiteface that they would make fun of the white people. But when the white folks then started their own minstrel shows, they created the most horrible, racist, terrible things they could possibly imagine at the time. Now, over time, it has ebbed and flowed, and I would like to bring up Al Jolson at this time as a perfect example of one way to look at blackface. Al Jolson he had starred in The Jazz Singer, where he very famously wore blackface. And people say, well, that was then, he was a man of his time, so on and so forth. Anyone that had a reasonable history of performing understood that blackface was a bad thing. I know of at least 3 circuses going back to the 1800s had rules against white people wearing blackface, or non-black people wearing blackface. And they understood. I know for a fact that there are circuses as early as the 1870s were saying, "Hey, white people, we're not doing this. This isn't right." Now, whether they were doing it because they thought that they were intentionally stealing money from people, whether they were doing it because it was in poor taste, it's a bit hard to understand the motivation a century or so later, but they were not doing it because they understood in the 1870s that it was uncool. And so Al Jolson probably at some point, he probably could have avoided doing it. Now, by the same token, Al Jolson helped dozens of black performers get their start in the business. Al Jolson was a man that apparently, if he saw talent, he didn't care what it looked like, what color it was. He wanted to put that talent before audiences, and he had enough swing that if Al Jolson called a record company or a radio station and said, hey, I need you to play this guy, this woman, this whatever. I saw this great act. They need to be in your show. That meant something, and it could begin careers. So we do have to, at some point, allow forgiveness in all of this. So Ephesians, the 4th chapter of Ephesians, verse 32, says, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as Christ God forgave you. That's pretty unambiguous. At some point, we do have to forgive people for things. Now, that said, we also shouldn't be allowing people that don't represent our values to be in charge of things. That's also a valid point. Now, looking at, let's say, for instance, the governor of Virginia. The governor of Virginia, years ago, wore blackface, and a white man in the 80s and 90s, definitely. If they didn't understand that that was, at the very best, in incredibly poor taste, I don't know what was working there. But the bottom line is, racism is as much part of the history of the United States and is as much a part of the fabric of what makes the United States as apple pie, Washington chopping down the cherry tree, the Declaration of Independence. We were a nation founded on the principle that some human beings deserved nothing. It's simple. We decided that women weren't smart enough to vote. If you didn't have any property, you didn't get to vote. And black people should be slaves. And of course, Native Americans, we needed to murder them and steal their land. And not to say nothing of the various other groups that have been treated bad over the last couple centuries. Jews being kept out of jobs, being treated poorly. When Italians, I mean, you name the group. They were treated badly when they came over. And consistently we have been treating African Americans poorly. And blackface is just another iteration of that whole horror. I remember as a young person on the road, there was a restaurant, I believe it was called the Hungry Hobo. And it was a cartoon of a person in blackface dressed as a hobo. That was their thing. This is my lifetime. There were, I don't recall the kitschy things that people, I don't remember it is, but those things are still, there are these little statues of Aunt Jemima or other sort of racist images. Those things are still being sold. Those things are still being made. So we have to, at some point, we either have to decide that 40, 50, 60% of the United States is so undeserving of forgiveness that they never get to speak again. They never get to be part of public life. They never get to be part of any public social discourse because they did something when they were younger. And in a time when we have people looking at everything that you're doing, you can go back 7, 8 years and see what people were tweeting about. We have to, at some point, come to some consensus of when someone can be forgiven for something. Now, by the same token, I'd like to read something from 2 Timothy. This is the 3rd chapter of 2 Timothy. Let's start at verse 2. 3rd chapter. I apologize. 2 Timothy, 3rd chapter, verse 2. There are just too many twos in that one for me. It just got me going there. Okay. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having any form of godliness but denying its power. Have nothing to do with them. When we are looking at this thing, there is also a senator, which we'll bring up, from Iowa, a Senator King. I've forgotten his first name, just got over me. He, within the last month or two, came out saying, hey, what's wrong with white supremacy? That's whites being supreme. That sounds like a great thing. And you go back, and it's just one gaffe after the next, or previous, and just so on and so forth. And we have senators who have stood in front of the Stars and Bars with Ku Klux Klansmen. At some point, we are going to have to decide, how long does someone have to be, let's say, in the doghouse for doing something that badly before we let them back in? Now, this governor, it appears that it's been 15, 20 years. I don't know the exact math. It's been 15, 20 years since he dressed up in blackface. Is that long enough? I don't know. But we have Senator King and his ilk have been trying to keep black people from voting. Governor of Virginia has been trying to get underprivileged folks health insurance. He's been trying to make sure that their vote is protected. Has he made amends for wearing blackface and standing next to someone dressed up like they're in the Ku Klux Klan yet? I don't know. But this, of course, brings us to the supreme example of when do you forgive someone? When does that person get to be part of the public discourse? And that is, of course, Saul. We recall Saul going on the road, getting struck down by God making him blind, and then eventually Saul realizing his error of his ways and becoming one of the most prolific writers, or actually the most prolific writer of the New Testament. God used him in a powerful and special way. I would like to think that after Saul had actually murdered several people, or created the mobs to murder several people, he came to understand how wrong he is, how terrible a thing that was. And he was able to become a better man. So, as we think about blackface, as we think about racism, it's not as simple as, wow, that guy's racist. Let's never talk to him again. Racism is woven into the fabric of America. If we kick everybody out of public office that did something racist in their past, some states would not have anyone to represent them. So we have to decide, when do we let people out of the doghouse? And that's the question that I put to you today. In the comments below, tell me, how long do you think it should take before someone is able to re-enter the public arena after doing something very stupid like that? Well, I thank you very much for your time. I ask you, as always, please, 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 please keep me in your prayers. I'll be keeping you in mind.